Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace joins host Chris Foster to discuss America's ongoing effort to continue the 2020 campaign and recent developments regarding the Russia probe. Also today marks the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Host Jessica Rosenthal speaks with two historians about how the Allies' victory in Europe changed the course of history and the parallels between World War II and the current global health crisis. Plus commentary from former White House speechwriter and Fox News contributor Mark Thiessen. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
I'm Maria Bartiromo.
I'm Greg Gutfeld.
I'm Liz Klayman, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, May 8th, 2020. I'm Chris Foster. Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace says about President Trump wanting to restart the economy and move past the coronavirus outbreak.
You can't spin a disease. It's either going to get worse or it's not going to get worse, and we're going to find out.
I'm Jessica Rosenthal. It's been 75 years since Germany surrendered in World War II. VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, was as much a celebration for the military as it was for everyone else.
First war in history where civilian casualties are greater than military casualties. You know, everyone in every country had a price to pay.
And I'm Mark Thiessen. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
It's the end of another week with millions more layoffs reported, but also a week with a lot more coronavirus restrictions eased or ended. In some states, it's golf and parks and beaches reopened. In some, it's hair salons, more retail, even if it's just curbside pickup. In some places, employees and customers are wearing masks, and no one's allowing large gatherings yet. It's a long way from normal, but a little bit closer to it, and President Trump tells Fox,
at some point, we have to open our country, and people are going to be safe. We've learned a lot. We've learned about the tremendous contagion, but we have no choice. We can't stay closed as a country. We're not going to have a country left.
A lot of Americans just want to get back to work, and the president would like to change the coronavirus conversation to a message of recovery.
Here's what isn't changing is the spread of the virus. Because while it is going down and they have bent the curve in New York State, in fact, it's continuing to go up or at least plateau in the rest of the country.
Chris Wallace is the host of Fox News Sunday.
We continue to have 25,000 new cases of the virus every day. And for the last 2 days, we've had more than 2,000 deaths. So, so many things we talk about, how do you feel about immigration or something like that? It's an opinion. And, there's no settling of it. In the end, there will be a fact here. It will be a huge fact, which is that the Trump administration and the governors, most of the governors, including a lot of Democrats, and almost all the Republicans, are reopening the country and reducing the barriers. And either it's going to be okay and we're not going to see a huge spike in cases, as the administration is saying and some of the governors are saying, or it's not, and we're going to, as a lot of the public health experts are saying, and we're going to see a big spike because we have not reduced the number of cases enough, and we don't have enough testing, we don't have enough contact tracing. You can't spin a disease. It's either going to get worse or it's not going to get worse, and we're going to find out.
You can maybe spin away. There's talk of, they're overcounting the deaths, when the truth is they're probably under-reporting the deaths. But people are saying, they had an underlying condition. They really died of a heart attack. They're calling it a COVID death. Okay, maybe you can hand wave away 10% of them, but it's still going to be a lot of people.
You can say that, but I've seen now that the White House supposedly is going to say that the count is too high. I think that's a really bad argument. I just think, it's not 2,000 who died today. It was only 1,600. Only 1,600. I mean, it's just.
Right.
It's. I just don't think that's a winning argument. People are going to know either the virus is going to get better or it's not. Either it's going to be safe to return or it's not. The facts are going to be obvious. You'll be able to see it in hospitals. You'll be able to see it in stores and things like that. And the other question is, in the end, it isn't just the governors and the president and even the store owners who get a vote. It's all of us. Are are your listeners out there, each one of you, are you going to feel safe going back to a restaurant or not? Are you going to feel safe getting on an airplane or going to a store? Each of us is going to have to make that decision ourselves. And you can open up everything, but if people don't feel comfortable doing it, the economy is not going to rebound.
And with these restrictions, let's say you open a restaurant at 50% capacity, is that going to be enough to bother keeping the lights on? And
or be able to keep the restaurant.
Right.
I mean, whether at 50% capacity, and I think that's extremely optimistic, because that's like we reduce the number of tables to put them 6 feet away, and every table that we have is filled. I don't think that's going to happen. At least according to the polls, 80% of people say, for instance, in a case of a restaurant, I would not feel comfortable going to a restaurant now. That's what the polls are indicating.
The polls also indicate that Democrats are more worried about the disease than Republicans. I wonder if those Republicans will. It's one thing to tell a pollster that. I wonder if they're actually going to go to those restaurants and go to those movie theaters.
I mean, that's good. I agree. It's going to be, again, I keep saying you can't spin a disease. It's an act of God. It's a fact of life. It's a natural phenomenon. And, it doesn't matter whether you're a liberal or a conservative, you can get just as sick.
So maybe this really doesn't happen until we have immunity tests or a really good treatment or, a vaccine. Best case scenario is the end of the year. Maybe we just live in this half-assed life until then.
I certainly agree that the vaccine is a huge thing. Again, I don't know anything about this. All I know, people are talking the end of the year, and maybe with our technology and our biotechnology and all of that, we'll be able to do it. But you read the history of vaccines, and I don't know that any of them have ever been invented, created, tested safely, and scaled up so that can be given to millions of people in what would essentially be about 6-8 months. That would be. I hope it happens. We can all pray for that. That would be quite an achievement.
Well, businesses are supposed to be getting the help they need to weather this without, having the freedom to reopen. I don't know what's happening with those promises. And then next, we're going to have this fight over aid to the states who are trying to avoid their own layoffs.
Well, that's right. And I was talking to a small businessman in D.C. the other day, and I asked him about whether he had gotten the PPP money, the Paycheck Protection Program money, and he said he had gotten it, but he's not sure he's going to use it, and he may give it back. And I said, why? And he said, well, D.C.'s in a different situation. D.C., they're still under a lockdown, and there's a lot of thought it might continue until the end of June. And he says the problem is that this PPP money runs out in early June, and if I have to keep everybody, bring them back, but now I've got to keep them till the end of June in full payment, I'll go bankrupt on that because I won't have any support. So you may have to see another bridge loan for the PPP to keep in places that aren't reopening, to keep people that are under the system solvent so that they don't go bankrupt. I mean, this is really complicated, and I fully understand the desire of the president, the governors, and it's going to be by this weekend 43 governors who will have either opened all or part of their state. I understand the desire to move on, but again, you can't spin a disease.
Since we last spoke, Joe Biden has publicly addressed the Tara Reade sexual assault allegation, but he hasn't made it go away. There's talk on both sides that maybe he won't be the nominee. I don't see how that happens logistically, barring some crazy medical thing.
I agree with you. I guess I saw Bill Bennett on television saying he thinks it's 50% chance that Biden isn't going to be the nominee. I would take that bet. Is it conceivable? Sure, you can always write scenarios for anything. But there doesn't seem to be. I mean, the thing that's most striking to me about the whole Biden-Tara Reade thing is that, for all their talk, and, there's clear hypocrisy here on the part of Democrats, clear double standard, where they jumped on Christine Blasey Ford's accusations against Brett Kavanaugh. Here they're saying, well, yeah, we heard her, and we heard what he's denied it, and we're going with Joe. So if it's somebody they like, they'll hear the accuser, but they're not going to believe the accuser.
Also this week, House Republicans have been pushing for the release of now declassified transcripts of interviews during the Russia election meddling investigation, claiming House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff has been blocking that.
The fact that Republicans are pushing so hard for it, the fact that Rick Grenell, who's a very politically connected guy, very much in the Trump team, and he's now the acting director of national intelligence, is pushing to release these transcripts. These are, as I understand it, these are the transcripts of the hearings that were held when the Republicans were in charge of the House Intel Committee back between 2017 and 2017 and 18, those 2 years before Adam Schiff took over. But Schiff now has been trying to stop them from being turned over. And one of the things is that Schiff came out after these hearings and said, well, there's hard evidence here in these closed, top secret or classified hearings that there was collusion between the president and the Russians. And, you know, the implication seems to be if the Republicans want to put him out, it's going to show that there was no evidence of collusion and Trump, and Schiff was just spinning a tail. I don't know. I mean, if you like Donald Trump, you already hate Adam Schiff. If you hate Donald Trump, you already like Adam Schiff. Whether it's going to change a lot of minds or not, I don't know. But, you know, it's always interesting to see whether somebody had backup for what he was saying at the time.
Sure. All right, Chris Wallace, what has become our weekly chat, the host of Fox News Sunday here on the Fox News Rundown. Chris, hopefully we'll do it again next week. Good to talk to you.
You bet. Thank you, Chris.
This is Mark Thiessen with your Fox News commentary coming up.
Today is the 75th anniversary of VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. The German surrender in World War II came almost immediately after Adolf Hitler killed himself.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hail the end of the war in Europe. It is 5 years and more since Hitler marched into Poland.
A war in which more civilians were killed than soldiers. So victory was not just for the military. Britain Ken Hay fought in Normandy alongside his brother. He remembers celebrating VE Day in the evening.
Some girls called out, "Hey soldier, give us a kiss." All the women were sort of coming round kissing her. I never had so many kisses, I've never had since. Everybody was coming up and kissing and well done and shaking hands and so on. It was a very joyous moment.
But up until VE Day, things were precarious. The Germans were looking for an alternative to surrender, but there was really nowhere for them to go. As one of our podcast guests put it, the Luftwaffe was destroyed, the Navy was stuck in port, the British and Americans were on the Elbe, and the Russians were in Berlin. It was over. Well, this part was over, the Europe part.
Well, there are two things I think people forget when they think about VE Day. First point is, it wasn't really the end of the war.
Saul David is professor of military history at the University of Buckingham.
Of course, it was the end of the war in Europe, and that had been raging since 1939. But there was an awful lot of fighting that carried on, actually, interestingly, in Europe. And of course, far more significantly than that, there was a war still going on in the Pacific. And until that was won, the Second World War would not be over. Japan, of course, had started the war in America by the Pearl Harbor action. And therefore, emotionally, I think Americans were much more closely tuned into what was going on in the Pacific than they were in Europe.
Right. Tell me, though, you are British, as we know, and this, this isn't in the distant history. Do you have any personal knowledge of VE Day, whether that's through relatives or older folks in your own life growing up in Britain that you may have talked to or have known that you can, I guess, share with us?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, my own mother, who's half American, actually, and although she was born in Britain and brought up in Britain and was in Britain for part of the war, she'd actually come over to America by the end of the war. And she said something quite interesting to me, which is that during VE Day, there was, of course, a famous speech by Churchill in which he talks about, the extraordinary long years of hardship, and then first Russia coming in on the side of the Allies, and then the Americans, and then finally they managed to defeat the terrible demon of Germany. She said she actually listened to that broadcast, Churchill giving that broadcast in America, because of course her parents were, her father was American, her mother was English, and they were interested in what was going on in Europe. And she said it was an incredibly emotional moment to hear that finally the war in Europe was over.
This was a war in which far more civilians died than members of the military, right? I mean, so celebration of a victory here takes on really different meaning This war just seems like it was so impactful to really everyone, your mother included. What was life like for civilians across Europe for these 5, almost 6 years?
Well, they talk about the First World War as the first total war, but you're absolutely right. The Second World War was the first time whole populations, mainly because of air power, of course, and the use of bombs, but whole populations were really dragged in, not only into the war effort that had happened in the First World War, but into the danger of war. And of course, the terrible end game is the huge casualties. First war in history where civilian casualties are greater than military casualties. You know, everyone in every country had a price to pay.
Over the years, these sort of like hindsight think pieces about, you know, how this war maybe could have been different, maybe even shorter, have been written. What in your mind were some of the Allies' missed opportunities or snafus? I was watching, as you know, as I've already told you, the greatest events of World War II in color on Netflix. And I watched one historian say that, you know, he nearly lost his mind when Allied forces failed to do the reconnaissance that would have shown them like a line of German tanks and soldiers waiting to push into France. I don't know if I'm recalling that correctly, but he said he becomes sort of unglued thinking about that sort of missed opportunity to take out all of those German forces and soldiers. What comes to your mind?
I think one of the biggest debates has been whether or not the Allies should have invaded Western Europe earlier. And in that particular debate, I'm very much on the side of no, it was right to wait. There was an original plan to go in 42, then in 43. A lot of pressure from the Russians, of course, because they wanted a second front to be opened to take the pressure off them. But I think the Allies were absolutely right to wait until 1944. Even in 44, the Germans in France and in Western Europe were a very formidable opposition. And if they hadn't waited, if I turn your question around and look at it from a slightly different perspective, if they had gone in 43, it could have been an absolute disaster. And that could have extended the war by a year or two.
But what about Germany? Professor and director of the Military History Center at the University of North Texas, Jeffrey Warrow, explains the Germans had big plans after World War I to create a new army. Though the terms ending World War I limited that new army, they eventually ignored those rules. They created new weapons, equipment, and tanks. But after the Blitzkrieg and Germany's rapid expansion, taking over multiple countries, a lot of things did not go as well as they'd hoped.
And really for the Germans, the fatal flaw is that Hitler is an ideologue, and he doesn't sort of respond to rational strategic calculus, and he doesn't realize that he's got a perfectly good non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. He ought to leave that in place, consolidate his victories in the West. Instead, in 1941, he attacks the Soviet Union and brings on this war of attrition with the Soviets that's bound to wear the Germans down. And then on Pearl Harbor Day, he compounds that error by, almost gratuitously declaring war on the United States to kind of buck up Japan and encourage it to fight, harder. Yeah. So that brings the U.S., which might have confined its operations to the Pacific, into the European war. So now you've got basically the Germans. Not only they've beaten Western Europe, they've chased the British back onto the British Isles. They're in a very strong position, but then he throws it all away by attacking the Soviet Union and declaring war on the United States.
Professor, talk to me about the civilians. Millions of civilians have died, and in my lifetime, when we've had war, we've talked about this need to of course, preserve civilian life, to not go after civilians, to make every effort, not to hurt civilians. That was so not the case in World War II.
The Germans basically had a genocidal campaign in the East. They wanted to basically remove the inhabitants of the East and open that space up, the whole space from Eastern Germany, east into the Soviet Union. And they wanted to take over everything up to the Urals mountains as a sort of a ground for German settlers. So they wanted to get rid of everybody there. They wanted to, and they wanted to kill all the Jews. The Jews, the bulk of the Jews in Europe were living in Poland. That's why if you look at Poland has these massive civilian casualties because the entire Jewish population of the Soviet Union living in the old Pale of Settlement in Poland and Belarus and Ukraine all of these people were rounded up and initially exterminated by firing squads, and then when these big death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka, Sobibor came online, they were then moved into these camps and killed, and so that's why you see all these casualties, and then plus 5 million Red Army prisoners taken by the Germans in these big battles of encirclement at the beginning of the war. They're all killed, either starved to death or left and die of hypothermia, or killed in the death camps themselves. Because of the Nazi program of genocide, because of this desperate Japanese attempt to use terror to, cow the Chinese population, you do see these massive, unprecedentedly huge civilian losses.
And ending those civilian losses is of course, a huge cause for celebration, as VE Day was, despite the continued war with Japan for another few months. But it was the beginning of a huge, giant, massive undertaking to heal with the Marshall Plan and, of course, the division of Germany. It's hard to underestimate just how much this war changed everything and still impacts us today. Our relationship with countries, the borders of countries, right? I mean, it's still, it either haunts us or it's contributing to how we operate.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when the war ends, you've got really hard choices at Yalta. These big wartime summits between the big three: Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin. Stalin, not only does he want sort of the spoils of war, but he wants security, and so he fears a resurgence of Germany. So he wants kind of a cordon of states in the east, like, basically the Central European and Balkan states. He wants those in Soviet hands, under, Soviet satellite states, so he can have this kind of physical barrier between the Soviet Union and Germany for the future. But he also wants to control that space to magnify Soviet power. In Europe, there's just a lot of acrimony after the war about what happened. There's that famous scene in the movie Patton where they're sort of partying after VE Day, and Patton's like, okay, on to Moscow. Now we have to beat the real enemy, the Soviets, But Patton's like a lonely voice. Everybody is just so exhausted by the war and so relieved that it's over that there's just no chance that, the United States is going to now invade the Soviet Union and try to topple Stalin, when basically everybody in the United States, Britain, everywhere, Soviet Union, they wanted to get back to normalcy. They wanted a peace dividend, and they wanted just to enjoy the fruits of peace after these horrific years of war.
Getting back to normalcy. Sound familiar? We keep hearing that now as some of us isolate due to the virus, as others battle illness and others lose their jobs. Professor Saul David sees the parallels.
I don't think actually the so-called war on the virus is overdone. It's not a literal war in which we're using we're using weapons to defeat it, but we are all coming together as a nation. I think there've been some very positive actions in the UK in which the whole country has had to behave in a certain way for the greater good, and that is no bad thing in that. And there's certainly, you can see comparisons with the Second World War. And if I just go back to making the point about 1945 not being an end game at VE Day because they were still fighting to continue, you very, very much get a sense of this togetherness. Both Truman and Churchill are talking about carrying on the war. The job is only half done. We need to defeat the Japanese now. And so you get a sense today, yes, it's not a similar type of war, but to bring everyone together in a common purpose, I actually think positive things will come out of this.
God willing. Professor Saul David, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network, download and listen to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. The host of The Story on Fox News Channel sits down with major newsmakers each week to get their untold story. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers. Almost 50 years ago, Dennis Runke was a student at Kansas State University when his father died suddenly, forcing him to leave school just 2 credits shy of his degree. In recent weeks, Runke has become known to America through a letter he sent to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who read it last month during a daily COVID-19 briefing.
I'm a retired farmer hunkered down in northeast Kansas with my wife, who has but one lung.
Runke had been watching the virus take lives in the hotspot of New York, and he had 5 N95 masks left over from his farm work in Kansas. He kept 4 for his family and sent the other one to the governor.
Would you please give this mask to a nurse or doctor in your state?
His actions went viral, and the Washington Post reports that when Kansas Governor Laura Kelly learned of it, she asked Kansas State University President Richard Myers if Runke could be awarded an honorary degree. Myers said Runke's decades of farm work were enough to make up for the 2 credits and gave him the real thing. This week, Runke got his bachelor's degree at a special ceremony, and in his address, he said he's heard from a lot of people following his viral moment.
Many of those who wrote to me to thank me asked me how they could help. Just pay it forward as much as you can afford to do so, to honor all those who have lost their lives to the C-19 virus, and also to honor the first responders who in some cases even lost their own lives in the line of duty. The ultimate sacrifice.
His mailing the mask has inspired others.
Nearly half of the many letters I received said that they were moved to tears when Governor Cuomo read my letter aloud. My life is forever changed.
One act of kindness with a national ripple effect. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Mark Thiessen.
What's on your mind?
President Trump said this weekend that we should have a vaccine for COVID-19 by the end of this year. We all hope he's right. America is the can-do nation with the most dynamic, innovative economy in human history. So most Americans just assume that we're going to be able to have an effective treatment available in a couple of months and a vaccine not far behind. But what if we don't? The Trump administration has launched Operation Warp Speed, a Manhattan Project-style effort to deliver a vaccine with 300 million doses by January. The president is to be commended for pressing his foot on the accelerator and clearing bureaucratic obstacles to vaccine development. But like putting a man on the moon, he's asking U.S. scientists to do something that has never been done before. Consider, the biopharmaceutical industry has been working on developing a vaccine for HIV for almost 40 years without success. We still don't have a cure for the common cold. Some colds are caused by a coronavirus. In fact, we have never developed a vaccine for a coronavirus before. And it took almost 5 years to produce a vaccine for Ebola, the fastest a vaccine has ever been developed for a dangerous new virus. To meet Trump's stated goal, we would have to more than quintuple that record. There are now about 95 vaccines for this virus under development. The vast majority will fail. Others may actually make it easier to catch the virus, or they may worsen the disease, which has happened with some HIV drugs. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, says, there are very few settings in medicine where you have the potential with a medical product to cause distributed harm, mass casualties. It's not a vaccine you're going to give to 10,000 people or 10 million people. It's a vaccine you're going to give to the entire world. And if it has some latent side effect that isn't apparent for many months and many years, and you've just given it to 100 million people, you can cause serious harm over a very large population, unquote. Gottlieb says we will have a vaccine in large clinical trials by the fall. But the more likely path out of today's lockdown is the development of an effective therapeutic, coupled with a very robust surveillance system that allows us to ring-fence small outbreaks before they become large outbreaks. But finding even one effective treatment is also incredibly hard. The most promising therapy under investigation is remdesivir, which was recently approved for emergency use in severely ill COVID-19 patients. A preliminary study found the drug improved recovery time from 15 days to 11 days, a 31% decrease, and showed no statistically significant effect on mortality. Avik Roy, a healthcare expert, says, The best that can be said about that drug is it shortens your hospital stay by a couple of days. It's not a cure. It's a modest improvement on the condition, unquote. Now, that's not what most people have in mind when they think of a therapeutic. They want something that treats their illness quickly and sends them back into the world. But the reality is we may not have that kind of treatment for some time, much less a vaccine that confers immunity. So what do? Roy argues that we may have to restart the economy before we have completely controlled the pandemic, reopening schools and businesses for lower-risk individuals and using contact tracing to slow the spread of the virus. He points out that about 100,000 people die every year in the United States from hospital-borne infections, yet we don't shut down the entire hospital industry. He says, quote, think of all the people who aren't seeking health care for non-COVID illnesses. How many of those people are going to die prematurely because they didn't get the health care they should have gotten in a normal environment? We've just thrown 30 million people out of their jobs. How many deaths of despair are we going to have take place because of the wreckage we've imposed on the economy, unquote. The search for a vaccine is a moonshot, and it may work. After all, America is the nation that put a man on the moon. But we can't keep the economy in lockdown while we wait. The purpose of the lockdown was not to prevent every American from getting COVID-19, but to prevent our healthcare system from being overwhelmed. Roy says, we've done that. It's time to stop annihilating the economy. I'm Mark Thiessen.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust, and click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.